Welcome back. We hope everyone had a good break and is feeling refreshed. We have a stellar panel for you now. Today we have representatives from 4 of the most impactful, famous, notorious Mexican-American civil rights organizations and Latino organizations. We have with us today from my far left, Nina Perales from the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund, an organization that was founded originally here in San Antonio. And then we have Lydia Camarillo from the Southwest Voter Registration and Education Project, also founded here in San Antonio, and this year celebrating their 50th anniversary. Next up is Charles Kamasaki. And I'm a little confused about this, Charles, but you seem to have 1 foot in retirement, 1 foot out of retirement, but you're affiliated with Unidos US, formerly known as National Council of La Raza. And finally, we have Chloe Latham Sikes, Dr. Chloe Latham Sikes from IDRA, another organization founded right here in San Antonio 50 years ago. So we have some amazing expertise up on this stage. Each of you has expertise spanning key civil rights areas, including voting rights, education, migration, and border policy. So I would like to ask, and we can just start with Chloe and head down the row here, what do you feel are the key policy issues facing Mexican Americans, and let's broaden it out a little bit and just say, and Latinos, in 2024?
Okay, well, thank you very much. What a question, thank you. But it's a real honor and pleasure to be here. There were a lot of statistics, as the former mayor shared, of 28% of U.S. population is Latino. In Texas public schools, it's 53% of public school students in Texas are Latino students. So every education policy issue is a Latino education policy issue in Texas. 42% are in post-secondary enrollment are Latino students. So really every higher education issue. And we see this at the fore now. So if I were to pick one that is very difficult, I know we'll dive into it a little bit more, but I would say, today is also the 70th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education decision, huge commemorative anniversary. And IDRA released a landing page and an ebook and classroom resources to commemorate this anniversary, but also tie it into the lineage of civil rights overall, starting with Mendez versus Westminster and desegregation civil rights. And then Brown v. Board, of course. This is also the 50th year of Lau v. Nichols, which secured language access for students in schools. And then we also acknowledge the 42nd anniversary of Plyler v. Doe, which secures the access for free public education for all students regardless of immigration status. Also a Texas Supreme Court case. So I would say the questions of access to real quality schools remains a major civil rights issue. And I know curriculum and books and instructional materials were discussed, and I think that access to representative knowledge continues to be one of our key civil rights issues in education.
Thanks. So thank you so much for the invitation to be here. We were joking that I was only invited because I'm integrating the panel, and both by gender and by race. I think it's not often called out as an issue, but Sara, you and the earlier speakers have also touched on it. I think it's getting a better understanding of the Latino community by all Americans. Some of us would call that narrative change, which is not kind of labeled as a civil rights issue necessarily, but it's probably more important now than ever. Sara run through a number of statistics. At Unidos, we've done a couple of reports in recent years, one on looking at high school textbooks. And we found that of the 6 most commonly used, widely used high school history textbooks, of the 200 or so essential topics, seminal topics that historians believe Americans need to understand about the Latino community, only 13% are even covered in typical textbooks. And even when they're covered, they're almost never include kind of a Latino voice or Latino agency, right? It's very often framed in a context of this was an important issue and Latinos were also involved, right? Or something to that effect. So think of everything from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, think of the founding of the continent, think of the Latino firsts, the cabinet member, first governor, first Supreme Court justice. Of all those kinds of topics that are essential for people to know, most Americans don't get that information from their school textbooks at all. And even when they are covered, as I noted, not from a perspective of where Latinos have any agency or are the subjects of the conversation, but more often are just the objects of the conversation. It's not surprising, therefore, that another study we did around media coverage of Latinos found that of articles that cover race, these are in the major American newspapers, right? New York Times, Dallas Morning News, and everything else. On subjects of race, Latinos only appear 6% of the time. And of that 6%, less than half of the time are Latinos ever quoted, right? So it's like, except for 3% of the stories, right, Latinos aren't appearing in major news coverage. We think those two things are related, right? Because it's not like reporters or editors are bad people and they come to these issues saying, we don't want to cover Latinos. It's that they don't know the basics about the community. And that's why MACRI is, not just an important organization, but an indispensable organization. That if it didn't exist, somebody would have to invent it. And I hope throughout this conversation we can talk more about what to do about this void in understanding about the Latino community.
Good morning. Thank you for this kind invitation. It's an opportunity to be here with all of you, not only here present, but those of you through the Zoom discussion, and some of you through this year that's a critical year for all of us. It's not only an election and our 50th anniversary at Southwest Voter. Yesterday, many of you were at the UTSA downtown celebrating Willie Velasquez, and before that, we were at your luncheon discussing the issues about how we will tell our story through your museum, and we look forward to helping you with that. But I want to say that because of who we are, Southwest Voter, we have to talk about the attack on democracy. We have to talk about the fact that never in my life did I think that as we move the organization forward and organized in communities across the Southwest, and more Latinos are registered, and for the first time in our history, Texas will see more than 3 million Latinos that are registered to vote, turning out to vote in Texas. Never did I think we were going to be discussing that America could go and turn in such a way that it becomes a fascist nation. And when I say that, I say it with a deep hurt in my heart, because the ones that are going to be hurt are our communities of color, and children who happen to be our future, our generation, our kids, our grandkids, and so forth. So a lot is at stake this election. I had the privilege and honor and a lot of support from MALDEF, thank you, of joining a panel at the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee to talk about voter suppression and how can we inspire all of us to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And I highlighted, in fact, voter suppression bills that we're seeing. But I also, when one of the members of the Senate asked me this question about what laws am I more worried about, whether it's Senate Bill 1 or the redistricting or Arizona's case in Arizona that we can share with you later, we don't have all the time here. But I said I was concerned not only of the laws that are currently being enacted that suppress the vote, and the laws that are coming that we will try to stop at state houses and through the courts, but I was also concerned with those unorganized, organized efforts to stop us from voting. From a woman who called me when we registered 30,000 voters in Florida, angry as heck, and she was right to be upset. Pissed is the word I used to say. I don't know if I can say that now, and I just said it. She said, I'm so angry at you. I just went to go vote. It's 4 o'clock. There's no time to fix this. And I said, okay, ma'am, tell me first of all, your name and what's the situation. You registered us, meaning Southwest Voter. Yes, ma'am, we did. Luckily, Diosito was with me because we registered 30,000 voters. Once I got her name, and that was at a time when we could make copies of those we had registered, I went back to the room, and 30,000 copies is a lot of copies. And I don't know why I didn't do this, flipping it one at a time. Instead, I like the ocean that was crossed by Moses, I opened it, and the second pile, the voter was there. And so I ran back to the phone and I said to this young woman, yes, ma'am, you were registered on such a date. Make sure that this is you. Give me your address again to make sure that we've got the right person, because ya ves que tenemos el mismo nombre a veces. There's a Lydia Camarillo in Arizona that I get confused. But she's like 30 years younger. So when I finished speaking to her, I said, ma'am, tell me again what you were told and why you were turned away. And she said, because you registered me after the deadline. And I said, ma'am, we registered you in August. I cited the date, I don't remember it right now, but it was August something. And I said, the deadline is October. And she goes, what? The deadline is October. Go back, tell them you must vote. Do not allow them to give you a provisional ballot, because that will not count. Make sure it's a ballot, and if they refuse to give you a ballot so that you can vote, call us back, and we'll call ABC, MSNBC, everybody under the sun to make sure that you vote. She calls me back an hour later and says, thank you. They were the ones that were lying. And I said, yes. Now, I think back, and I was telling folks after this, the senator asked me the question, we were out from the hearing, why didn't I just call the press anyways? I got to be better about that. So I live in Chip Roy's district. And when I started and bought my house there, it was Congressman Gonzalez. Then it was Lamar Smith. Now it's Roy Chip. Every time I vote on election day versus early vote, which by the way, I love early voting, we all must make sure we vote in early because something always happens. But every time I vote in my precinct on election day, I am undoubtedly going to be told, and I warned this to my family, guess what, lady, you're not registered to vote. Every single time, without exception. And if I'm in a good mood, I'll say things like, maybe you have my last name misspelled wrong. Maybe you have my address wrong. And of course, they have the copy of the ID, because that's another case we fought in court, the voter ID. And if I tell them I'm about to call the press, because now I'm getting impatient and angry, please find me, I'm a voter, and this is what I do. This is my business. This is what we do. We mobilize voters, and we turn them out to vote, and we learn the rules. They always find me in a second. But this is what I have a concern with. How do we capture and document those moments of hundreds of people that are being turned away, and not to mention all the laws that are prohibiting us from having the right to vote? And more importantly, why aren't we, if we're serious about telling the world and the world and other countries that we must fight for democracy, that we ourselves are not protecting our own democracy? Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me? I can't tell. Thank you very much. Now there. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's really a privilege to be here with you, but also be a panelist with this wonderful group of people who are so accomplished. I'm torn. We've heard about education policy, and about political participation, and MALDEF works in both of these areas and more, but I think I'm going to settle on continuing with some themes that Lydia has brought up. Although I do want to mention that there is a school district in Texas that has banned a book on Mendez versus Westminster. It's a children's book, and it faithfully retells the story that Sylvia Mendez tells about being the little girl who was at the center of this lawsuit and what it meant for her to be turned away from the white school and then eventually go to the white school. And there was even a little bit of trouble when that happened as well. Well, that book is apparently just too controversial and has been banned. So I bought the book off Amazon. I put it on my shelf at work because as soon as I can free up a handy attorney, we will bring that case. There's absolutely no reason to have banned that book. There's no, special sensitivity. Other than, I suppose, if you have a sensitivity about learning about racism, this could be potentially a problem for you because that book is about discrimination. But I do want to turn and just say a couple of things about political participation. I know that we often talk about sort of structural barriers, but I want to talk about a different sort of structural barrier, and it has to do with political participation in the Latino community. We know that people who register and vote, that those rates go up as age goes up, as income goes up, and as education goes up. The more educated somebody is, the more money they have, and the older they are, the more likely they are to vote. Well, if you want to make observations about the demographics of the Latino community in the United States, let's revisit those three factors. We tend to be younger because we have larger families. We tend to have lower socioeconomic status because of the legacy of discrimination, but also because of new folks arriving. Even U.S. citizens who are naturalized tend to be, well, not only lower educational achievement level, but also lower income. So this is something structural about our community that I think we need to spend time thinking about, because I know for my age, I'm a very faithful voter. For anybody in the room who's my age or older, I bet you're very faithful voters too. But I just met some new interns with Southwest Voter. Wave to me. I met you, right? Look at them waving their hands. Do they look like they're my age? No. And they're probably registered to vote because they're interns with Southwest Voter, and they're registering others. But you get my point. If our Latino political participation rates matched the political participation rates of other groups in Texas who tend to be older, better educated, and wealthier than us, things would change very quickly in the state, right? The people we elect would change, the policies, including what gets taught in school, would change. So what haunts me the most when I'm not actually doing something at work, like drafting something or on a Zoom call, when I have those sort of quiet moments of reflection, what I think of as perhaps the biggest challenge for our community right now is how do we increase our political participation rates, even just to match? We don't have to exceed, even just to match that of, for example, the Anglo community in Texas. And I think we would create great change by doing that.
Okay, now I would like to drill down into some of your respective areas of expertise. So, Chloe, in regards to education, in recent years there have been increased efforts to introduce ethnic studies to K through 12 classrooms. Where are we with that today, and how have recent policies like book bans and anti-DEI laws impacted public education?
It's a great question, and I think this was really appropriately previewed and framed by your remarks and the remarks of the mayor and former Mayor Castro. This is a really critical issue. About at least 20 states, including Texas, have passed what we call K-12 censorship laws. So censoring classroom discussions, teaching lessons, and other types of sometimes books and instructional materials that reference race, gender, oppression, current events, political history, all of these that are characterized in that statutory language as prohibited or divisive concepts. Now, in Texas's law, I should say, and IDRA has a guide called the SB3, Guide to Senate Bill 3, which was that bill in late 2021, or a guide to classroom censorship laws on our site, but the words critical race theory are not referenced in the bill. There are no text titles in the bill, save for naming the 1619 project and just saying it can't be required, which we disagree with, but it also is not, there's no banning of books in the law. The word equity is not referenced in the law. We fought the law tooth and nail in its various iterations. It did eventually pass. And all that to say, book bans and the proliferation to that broader chilling effect of censorship of speech, of teaching, relevant events, whether it's history, whether it's current events, whether it's things going on in politics or society or in students' homes and communities, that is all entirely from the broad-based interpretation from confusing and vague and chilling law, which is what it is. And so that, we believe, is the intent, and testified that that was the intent of that law. Now, I know this is getting away a little bit from your question on ethnic studies. It's related. Ethnic studies is also not named in that bill, nor are any specific course titles. In Texas, Mexican American Studies and African American Studies are two social studies elective courses at the high school level that are on the books with TEKS aligned standards, with adopted standards from the state board. That is excellent, and we want to keep it that way. And there's been a push with American Indian Native Studies, which has been a really successful community-based pilot program in Grand Prairie for several years, and a budding movement around Asian American Studies to join that catalog of ethnic studies courses at the high school level. And they've met some resistance. The State Board of Education has shifted, is not as amenable to adopting those as official courses that are standards aligned. And they're still in pilot programs in various districts and can be, but it's a tension to protect what has been gained in ethnic studies, to further that, but also to stave off any rollbacks. And I think we heard the framing of that is an intentional effort of these censorship laws, of chilling speech, is a rolling back of honest discussions of history and race and gender and representation and oppression. Likely why the Sylvia Mendez storybook is banned and one of hundreds on banned book lists. Many of which have to do with civil rights histories, many of which are children's books, some of which are in Spanish. So we're holding the line on ethnic studies. It would be the simplest way to say that. I don't want to take too much time on this question. Did you ask about higher education?
Please say something about higher education.
Okay. I'll just say on higher education, Texas is one of about 8 states that has passed a ban on diversity, equity, and inclusion offices, the offices that were tasked with implementing the actual remedies associated with those civil rights cases we mentioned, and the movements and gains and strides of so many Latino professors and Black professors and scholars and researchers and community advocates, embedding practices that support students' college access and success, and connecting to that broader network of people, educated people in workforce and in life. And we have rolled that back in Texas severely. This was something that a coalition we convened called the Texas Legislative Education Equity Coalition, Unidos US and MALDEF and MACRI are members of this 38-member coalition. But it has been implemented with full force, and I will say on Tuesday, there was a Texas Senate hearing to monitor the implementation and compliance of this bill, Senate Bill 17 from last spring. And university chancellors spoke with great pride about their over-compliance, their broad interpretation, how many people have been fired, how many centers closed, how, programs that have been shuffled, redistributed, how they're going to, shift that funding, how no funding's going towards these programs. And it's hundreds of students and faculty and community advocates also testified to those harms, to those real lived harms. But all that to say, we're seeing that on the K-12 level and higher ed, there's a real effort to understand and communicate these are widely unpopular policies that, that nonetheless have been very powerful and very immediate in their effect. So that's the status, and I know we'll talk more about that.
Thank you, Chloe. Charles, a few years ago, you published a book on immigration reform, particularly the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. I was wondering if you could share what is different or the same about the so-called immigration crisis of today, and what would you see as an appropriate response to this so-called crisis?
Thank you for that question. Thank you for mentioning the book. Can I go off topic before I answer that question? Because I just want to build on this, on Chloe's answer and your opening remarks. These are really tough times, right, around many issues, including the voting rights and voting access. But, in terms of our motivation to do this work, I think it's important for us to know, but more importantly for us to say, these are not just issues that affect Latinos. Some of the same studies that you cited, Sara, demonstrate that all students do better when they're exposed to a more inclusive curriculum. And I know my life has been enormously enriched because, at some point I was assigned Bury My Heart at the Wounded Knee about Native Americans, or the letter from a Birmingham jail that Martin Luther King wrote, right? We are better citizens. We are better people when we are exposed to these more inclusive curricula. And even as tough as things are, I will say that you can overcome these. I remember my former boss, Raul Izaguirre, 30 years ago, co-chaired a commission, a Smithsonian commission, that demanded the creation of a Latino museum. And the response of the intelligentsia, the chattering class in DC, was never happen, can't happen, impossible. And a lot of other people, including folks of Sara's generation, the scholars at UCLA, countless other folks, kept at it, and it's gonna happen. And there's nothing that anyone out there can do right now that is against that. They can't stop it. So it is worth investing in this work. On immigration, I could go on forever, which I will try not to do, but let me just say there's a lot of bad actors on the right on these issues. And I think we instinctively know that, right? This talk about invasion, or replacement theory, or all that stuff that's so ugly and so nasty is really freezing our politics. I would also tell you, I think we have a problem among progressives, quote unquote, as well. That I don't believe we are making the case enough about why immigration is good for the country. I don't think we are making the case enough about not just the people arriving seeking asylum, but the long-term undocumented who have been here often for decades, have American citizen kids, are contributing to the society, paying taxes, supporting the Social Security system, which its trustees say is, could start to go bankrupt in a decade. And I would just say from our perspective as Latino advocates, I think we need to do a better job of making the case. With respect to what's happening right now, we have a situation where, frankly, our border policies were meant to keep Mexicans out. And there's a long history for how that was created. Once you have people who are coming what the Border Patrol quaintly calls other than Mexicans, OTMs, they have a whole bunch more rights, frankly, including the right to ask for asylum. And our asylum system was not created and not funded and not structured in a way that can accommodate those people. Now, I will also say, my personal opinion, not speaking for Unidos US, that the vast majority of people who are applying for asylum don't actually qualify for asylum under our laws. That doesn't mean our laws shouldn't be changed or broadened, but that's just a fact. And so when you have a system that can't handle the numbers of applicants, and at the same time, but there are legitimate bona fide asylum applicants in that mix, you're going to have a huge problem. I would also say one of the things that's not been discussed often enough is, yes, there are repressive governments in Central America, frankly, and elsewhere in Latin America. Those have existed for a long time. And frankly, you know, the Republicans blaming the Biden administration, saying it's their policies, and, you know, I think that's largely untrue, although I suspect there are some people who thought they would get a break, better break under Biden than they did under Trump. I don't think that's unreasonable. But probably the biggest reason is economic. The COVID-19 pandemic devastated economies in Latin America. And unlike in the US, where we had something of a robust safety net, really a bipartisan safety net, they didn't have that. And so it's this combination of repressive regimes, some changes in policy, and the after effects of the pandemic that have created an unprecedented response. I personally think the administration is doing kind of, sort of, as best it can, even though I fault them for, where I started, for not really making the case that I think they should be. You know, too many Democrats think, and there are literally people who say this, you know, any day the president doesn't talk about immigration is a good day. Let me want to rest on that statement for a second. That is like religion inside the White House. And so as long as we don't make our case, and as long as our political leaders don't make our case, we're going to have a mess.
Thank you for that. Lydia, it's Southwest Voters' 50th anniversary, and voter engagement has long been the center of Southwest's work. How is voter engagement looking in the 2024 election, and what obstacles might be in the way of stronger voter turnout?
There's always lots of challenges and obstacles for both registering voters and turning them out to vote. I think the one that I always sort of try to figure out how we overturn that instinct that, especially in Texas, where we're such a large state, and in 2020, Texas became a competitive state according to all the data, but nobody wants to invest it, so it sort of stays stagnant. It sort of stays where nothing is moving. The competitive states are basically going to generate something like 10 million voters, where there's about 150 million voters that are going to vote. And that's where people spend their money, and they don't spend it on the states where they could make a difference. Texas has 40 electoral votes. It will make a big difference. In 2016, when there was less registered Latino voters, only about 2.4 million registered Latino voters, compared to now we're going to be close to 4 million. The divide between the U.S. Senate, Beto and Cruz at the time was less than 2 percentage points. So there's an opportunity in Texas if we do the work. Now, for me, at Southwest Voter, I think Willie was the same as Andy Hernandez, our board member. Say hello, Andy. And former board members, Dora Olivo, and Dr. David Montejano, who's also a former staff member. Gilberto, I haven't remembered, you were also a staff member. Graciela, are you here? There you are, perdón. A staff member, and if I missed you, I apologize, plus Manuel Garza and the students that are helping us mobilize. Our challenge always is how to explain to a voter the power of their vote collectively. How do we explain to a voter when they think that their vote doesn't count, doesn't matter, that collectively you can change the world and make a difference, and by electing candidates who will fight in your interest and the community's interest, you end up winning. That is the challenge. However, in spite of that, in presidential cycles, we see a higher number of voters across the board, and Nina was correct. The Latino electorate is one of the youngest. The Asian community is beating us, but it's one of the youngest, fastest electorate that is growing and continues to grow. But it's also an electorate that few invest in other than groups like Southwest Voter and other groups that are investing. In California, there is a difference. Labor and Latino leaders and other folks, environmentalists, are invested in the Latino vote. In fact, when 2001, when California wanted to pass one of the largest environmental clean water initiatives, they argued that they were going to lose because the white voters refused to vote in that direction of passing that $40 billion bill that would clean the water and create parks. And I remember at that point, I wasn't with Southwest Voter at that point. I had just finished doing something else and was working independently. And I remember saying, the Latino vote will pay extra taxes to clean waters, create parks, build schools, even if it's very poor, because the Latino community understands collectively that together we can make a difference. So the biggest challenge is investment. The next challenge is having people understand that every election, no matter what election it is, our vote counts. And when we move local elections to midterm and presidential elections to coincide in Texas, we will see a higher number of people voting in the elections. We just saw in Rock Spring, me va a regañar Manuel, a victory of a Latina winning. But originally it was a tie, and they were trying to figure out how they were going to do it. And they did a recount, and the Latina just won in that school district. It takes every single vote. I ask you, and I challenge you, if I may say the last thing, get 10 people to register to vote. Get those 10 people to vote. And I'm not going to ask you to do the Tupperware thing, but I will tell you that it takes 4 conversations so that these new voters will vote. High propensity voters are all of us or better. We're going to remember to go vote. Other groups will spend resources on calling all of us. How many of you get texts and emails and calls every single day about an election? Not only about that, but making sure that you give donations. But do they call new voters, newly registered voters? They do not. And so that's our challenge. And the most important thing is that we can make history in Texas and across the country, and it will be the Latino vote that will decide who will be in the White House, who will control the U.S. Senate, and who will control the congressional districts. There's 25 congressional districts where Latinos will decide the future, only if we are engaged. 2 of which are here in Texas, the 23rd and the 19th, which are also part of our redistricting case.
Thank you, Lydia. Nina, MALDEF has long been at the forefront of Mexican-American civil rights litigation. What's an example of current civil rights litigation that the public should know more about?
So I could answer by just naming one case. And if I had to, I would name the lawsuit over the current Texas voter suppression law, which had a lot of different aspects to it that tended to make voting more difficult across a number of areas. You would have read in the newspaper about how voting by mail is now more difficult because you have to put an ID number. Anybody who navigated vote by mail since 2021, God bless you, because it's really hard now. There are spaces in like 6-point font where you've got to provide information. And then even if you do everything right, if the elections office doesn't have that particular ID number on file for you, which happens to be the ID number you used when you registered to vote 4 million years ago, then your ballot is still going to get rejected, right? So a lot of people heard about that. There are other parts of that law that are less well-known, but I believe aimed at the Latino community. So for example, we, among others, including Southwest Voter, we represent an organization in the Valley, in the Rio Grande Valley, where members come in for help filling out their mail ballots, right? And Southwest Voter can also end up having somebody come and say, can you help me with my mail ballot? Well, it's now unlawful to have a paid staff person assist somebody with their mail ballot. So, you have somebody who's older, doesn't see that well, remember the 6-point font, maybe is just unsure about navigating the ballot in that particular language. It cannot be a paid staff person who helps. We didn't hear too much about that in the news, but that's another aspect of SB1. So if I had to name something and tell you to keep your eye on it, I would say keep your eye on it, but more generally, keep your eye on efforts to make either registration or voting more difficult. And it doesn't have to be a complete ban. It just has to take bites out of it, right? We'll take a bite out of people who vote by mail. We'll take a bite out of this group. We'll take a bite out of folks who don't have ready access to their identification cards. It's sort of death by 1,000 cuts, right? There's a new bill introduced in Congress. It's not going to pass, but it's very much in the news right now. It would require proof of citizenship, U.S. citizenship, some kind of document proving your U.S. citizenship in order to be able to register to vote, right? I worked on a case like this in Arizona, and tens of thousands of people were rejected for voter registration when there was a requirement to provide a document. And just imagine that we're at some community event. We're at Fiesta, you all and us, and Lydia has a clipboard. She wants to register you to vote because in this pretend scenario, you're not registered to vote, right? So Lydia is going to come up to you and she's going to ask to register you to vote, and you're going to say, I would love to register to vote. And then she's going to say, well, we have a documentary proof of citizenship requirement. Please raise your hand if you have a document on you right now proving you're a U.S. citizen. And don't because you have a driver's license. Driver's license doesn't prove your U.S. citizenship. So raise your hand if you've got your birth certificate, your NAT certificate, your certificate of citizenship, or your U.S. passport. In my phone. 2 people. In your phone, and that's probably not good enough. So we're down to 1, Manuel, who's clearly concerned. Somebody's going to stop him and ask him for his proof of citizenship. So you can see, you could have all been registered to vote, but you don't have it. And even if you did, would you give it to somebody you don't know to photocopy, to send in with your voter registry? And would she be pulling a photocopy machine behind her at Fiesta? How long an extension cord would you need for that? So the impact in Arizona before we won that case was tens of thousands of people were turned down who had already put in their voter registration application. That's already a lot of work. Most of them were white because most people in Arizona are white. Most people registering to vote are white. Most people getting rejected were white, along with a lot of Latinos. So why do it? Because it stops us from changing the face of the electorate. If you can make voter registration harder and slow it down, you're slowing down the inevitable process of the face of the electorate changing. So there are folks pushing these policies who don't even care if lots of white folks are going to get rejected for voter registration, because it's more about holding the status quo than it is about anything else. So if you're going to be watching lawsuits, watch for lawsuits where the underlying question or the underlying topic is, how is this going to affect the impact of demographic change on voter registration and participation?
Thank you, Nina. We're just going to do one last question, and so this is sort of lightning round. But what is one thing you would like everyone watching today to take action on?
Okay.
I know, just one.
Okay, just one. I would say if you don't have a school-age person in your life, find one. Oh, did I take it? Sorry. Well, I had two, so I won't go to my backup. But education policy is kind of a black box, and people think, oh, well, I don't know what that means. I don't know what education policy means. Everyone has some experience with school or schooling. So everyone, and we believe this at IDRA, is a policy advocate. Everyone has a history with education. And if you don't know someone who is currently in schools at any level, I highly encourage you to know someone. We just released a report from led by high school students here in San Antonio called MAS for our schools, Mexican American Studies for our schools. I encourage you to read it. Youth are researchers, they are scholars, and they are change makers. So get to know a young person.
I'm going to answer a slightly different question. I know I probably left you with not a great impression of the current status of immigration policy. I think it's true. But I also think these things can be overcome. In fact, the book that I wrote that you so kindly mentioned, Sara, tells a story about how largely Mexican-American Latino civil rights organizations confronted a very enforcement-heavy immigration reform bill back in the 80s. It was called the Simpson-Mazzoli bill. Many of you might remember it. And it was heavily weighted towards enforcement. Had a little tiny legalization program, plus a major temporary worker program, another bracero program, basically, that would allow people to be imported into this country to be exploited. And I was lucky enough to be a very junior member of a coalition that worked continuously over the years, from when the bill was first introduced in 1981 through a cycle in 1982 when it passed the House, passed the Senate but died in the House, through 1984 where it died in conference committee, to 1986 when it finally passed. And that bill, and was very controversial about, and NCLR, then NCLR, now Unidos, was one of those that largely acceded to the enactment of that bill. Very controversial at the time. It legalized 3 million previously undocumented people. And instead of a bracero-type guest worker program, it included a green card program for farm workers. Now, at the time, it was viewed very much as a mixed success, and it was. There were some bad parts of that bill, no question about it. But kind of looking back and looking at immigration reform attempts since then, right, not half bad. And so I would tell you, whether it was the story I mentioned about the Smithsonian or about issues like immigration or ethnic studies, at times like this when it's really hard, what I would ask is whatever field you're working on, voting rights, health, education, immigration, you have to work at it as if you believe that a good outcome can be achieved. You're not going to win every battle. You're going to lose a lot more than you win. But over time, as Martin Luther King said, I think the arc of history does bend toward justice, and you want to be on the right side of those debates.
Well, I think I had already asked you to go home and find 10 people that are not registered to vote. Make sure you speak to them 4 times. Maybe this year we'll give a car away and we'll call you and you can sign up and win the car, as did Maria Antonieta's grandnephew won in 2000 when he made a lot of calls. But I also want you to make a donation to your favorite organization to help make sure you get the vote. If it's not Southwest Voter, it's going to be somebody else. Of course, I would prefer it be Southwest Voter, but I understand. There's competition out there and everybody's doing work. Our work is endless. It takes a lot of resources to turn out a voter. Again, groups like mine, Southwest Voter, we're targeting newly registered voters or voters who will be turning out for the first time in a presidential general election. That is different than some of the other groups that will be targeting people like us that already vote. So make a donation. Also help us make sure that we have our future museum. Whatever Sara needs, let's help her do that. And I have a bias to MALDEF because they're our attorneys and we have a lot of cases, and she's my sister from another mother. So please keep supporting MALDEF. The cases that they work on, Nina and Tom always win. So let's give everybody a hand. And remember that together we can change the world. Gracias.
Well, that was a drop the mic moment. So I never want to say anything after someone says give money to MALDEF, but I will say, I became an empty nester about 2 years ago. I don't have any children with me anymore. I don't have any more teenagers to interact with in my house. So I have 2 nieces living with me. They go to UTSA and separately the Health Science Center, and it is fantastic. So I would encourage all of you, this is sort of a twist on get someone young into your life. Get someone young into your house. Because if you can take a young woman who is struggling to pay for her tuition and her living expenses, and the dorms are very expensive, if you can take a young woman or a young man and have them live with you, first of all, you're going to produce somebody who's going to go out in the world and do great things. But also, they're going to give you this incredible gift of perspective. I've been talking so much more about young people since I had young people in my life, right? And how do you cultivate in a young Latino person that you want voting that sense of we have a collective task here. We're all in this together. Because the kids are all on their phones and they're all very much sort of insular. It's them and TikTok. But how do you commence a conversation with a young person about how we're all in this together? And that's why it's super important to vote. You think your one vote is tiny little fish in the ocean, but it's not, because of the power of collective action. Maybe that conversation starts with choice, honestly, because I think my nieces would have more to say about that than a particular experience they might have had experiencing racism, partly because they're from the Valley, right? But it's about, like, how do I strategically begin that conversation? What are the things that I need to say as a committed voter to create another committed voter? And just figure it out and do it over and over and over again, because as I return to my initial point, if we can participate, we can change everything, and we can change it right away.
I want to acknowledge that MALDEF, Southwest Voter, Unidos US, and IDRA represent over 200 years of advocating for civil rights. So these people are doing very important work, and I so appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today.